the third week of Advent. This is Joy Sunday, and a great definition for joy is simply celebration. So we have come to a day of celebration. And so, of course, I'm going to start it off by talking about money, because why not? Nothing seems to make sense, so let's just keep that rolling along. So every year at Christmas time, my family, my wife and I sit down, and we have a talk about what kind of code we're going to follow for Christmas shopping. We have to have a couple of things lined up before we can go off and do the things that we want to do and celebrate the way we want to celebrate. The first thing is we have to decide what kind of gifts we're going to get people. For our kids, we have some things that we want to make sure we're getting them every year. We usually do socks for Advent. We usually have some sort of thing to focus on their relationship with God, something they want, something they need, those sorts of things. We're going to try and figure out what kinds of things we want to get for people. We have to figure out who we're going to give to. The bigger the net, the smaller the gift, right? And so we have to think about how many people we're giving for, what we're going to give, those sorts of things. And then we have to talk about the budget. How much, when it's all said and done, do we want to have spent on these gifts? And I don't know about what your house is like, but that is always the sticking point. It's like we do really good about sticking to the gifts we say we want to get. We do really good about sticking to the people we want to give to. But sticking to the budget we want to spend is always the hardest part. To be honest, I don't know if there's a year where we were ever perfect about that. If we ever focused in on the code we agreed on all the way through. When God was setting up his people, he gave them 4 rules to use economically, rules that really settled down about money and how it was supposed to be used and spent, that were also set in place ahead of time. So these were the things they were supposed to follow so that everything else made sense and fit together right. The first one was tithing, that they were supposed to entrust back to God 10% of what he had entrusted to them. This was supposed to be able to take care of the church and the priests and the pastors and the poor. It was also a sign of trust between those who were giving and God, that they really knew who was responsible for what they had. The second one is Sabbath. And you don't think about that as an economic thing, but they were supposed to take one day off from working every week. A day to rest, to worship, and to be restored. And to be reminded that the world doesn't stop spinning when you stop moving. The third thing was called gleaning. When they went out to harvest at harvest time, they were supposed to leave the edges of the fields untouched, part of the fruit on the trees alone, so that the poor and the refugees that were traveling through and those that were lost or homeless would be able to come and find something to eat. That they too would be able to be taken care of out of what had been given by God through that harvest. And then there's the fourth one. We have no record ever of this fourth one being practiced by the Israelites. It is probably the best one, and it is also the one that is the hardest to get your heart around at the same time. And I think that's why it was never practiced. But it was called Jubilee. It was also known as the year of the Lord's favor and was looked to as what God was going to do when he returned, because it's a divine reset. It is a rebirth, a re-beginning for everyone. And so the 3 things that were supposed to happen at Jubilee was, number 1, all of the debts were supposed to be forgiven. Could you imagine the freedom that comes when your bills show up and you don't have the anxiety in your chest when you have to look at them? The phone calls that you screen that you don't want to answer, all of those things are gone. And for them as well as for us, it also was a chance to get out from underneath some masters that they did not want to follow anymore. But because they owed them, they were enslaved to them in essence. And this was a chance to break free from that. It was also a chance for family land to be returned. Now, land was security. It was a place that you owned that meant that you had a place to belong and had a way to provide your basic needs. And sometimes over time and over bad choices or circumstances, that would be lost. But here was a chance to have that restored again. And the third thing was the release from prison. people were going to have a chance to start over, a chance for something new to break in. And so the whole intention of Jubilee was that grace and hope and incredible, tremendous joy, celebration would break out amongst the people. And yet it never happened quite like it was supposed to. Could you imagine, though, if it did? I mean, think about for yourself right now. Could you use a Jubilee? Could you use a divine reset in your life? Or maybe even just a part of your life? For too many of us, Thanksgiving comes and goes, and it goes right into the season, and we're expected, we feel the weight and the pressure of having a holly, jolly Christmas, right? Where everyone's supposed to be cheerful and happy, and there's parties and there's celebration, but far too often, underneath of all the bright lights, there is still this cloud that covers over our hearts or over our heads. There is a darkness that tries to dim the glow of the candles and the Christmas trees. For some, it's the pain of a grief that they carry. For others, it's just heartache that the people that they wish they could be with or celebrating with aren't there for all kinds of different tragic reasons. For others, it's the reminder that everything else that people are celebrating with, the food and the candy and the gifts, are things that they cannot afford and cannot have. For others, the fact that they see people enjoying themselves and celebrating while they are stuck in place is a reminder about what the other people have that they have lost. It just seems like these things can get amplified during this time. And so to come and hear a message about joy where we just come and we say, man, joy is so awesome. Aren't you so glad that you get to be happy today and things are good and life is great and beautiful and all that stuff? It doesn't really fit because too many of us, in fact, if statistics are right, probably 1 in 5 of us or more, we don't feel that way any day. Some of us, it's just we don't feel that way for a day. Others of us, we don't feel that way every day. We feel trapped. We feel trapped by our emotions or our past or our relationships or our economic level. We just feel trapped. I learned a couple weeks ago about a guy who also knew that feeling. His name is Martin Pistorius. He was from South Africa. And as a boy, he was just a normal kid. He would run and play and do all things that normal kids do until he was 12 years old. When he was 12, a strange illness hit him, and suddenly everything that he could control about his body disappeared. He couldn't move on his own anymore. He could not speak on his own anymore. He was just a shell, stuck in a persistent vegetative state. And this was supposed to be something that would kill him quickly, and yet he persisted in this for over a decade. The parents and his doctors thought that there was no awareness, like nothing was going on inside of Martin's head. He was just a shell. He was literally almost like a house plant, which they had the job of keeping alive. But inside, he was still there. He was aware of everything that was going on around him, but he was trapped in his own body. Can you imagine what that must have been like? To see everybody running and playing and laughing and eating around him, talking to each other around him, and to be aware of that, to want to join in on that, to have something to say in the conversation and being completely unable to do anything. He says one of his worst fears happened, that he was stuck in front of the TV hours at a time, being forced to watch Barney and the Teletubbies. He would be fed food, and if it was too hot, it would burn him, and he couldn't even cry to let them know that it hurt. He had no way to communicate. Totally powerless, totally alone. Can you relate to how Martin feels? You feel trapped. There's this shameful memory in your past that has just torn down your life. And not everybody knows about it, but you know about it, and it affects every decision that you make, everything you try and do. It consumes all of it. And you're trapped by it. That fear that you can't shake, the bitter memory of what was done to you and the person that did it to you, and there's no way you're going to forget it, and you are certainly not going to be able to forgive or move on. You're trapped by it. You relive it all of the time. Maybe it's an anxiety, that worry that just keeps you up at night that you cannot get yourself free from. Maybe it's your confusion about not knowing what to do or who you are or where to go or this job or that job, and all of it is just overwhelming. Whatever it is, you are trapped and you are stuck and you feel powerless. And you feel alone. Because when you're in the midst of despairing circumstances, that's how you feel. Like no one else knows what's going on with you. No one else can see you or be with you or help you. And you got to imagine that's how Martin felt in the midst of where he was, stuck in his own body like that. But he says that even in that moment, he wasn't alone. This is what he says. He says, the only person who knew there was a boy in this useless shell was God. And I had no idea why I felt his presence so strongly. He was with me as my mind knitted itself back together. He was as present to me as air, as constant as breathing, and he was the only person I could talk to. I got to tell you this. If you forget everything else, remember this. Even when you feel trapped, Christ can bring joy. Even when you feel hopeless and powerless, Christ can show up with you in the midst of that and give you reason to celebrate. You see, joy doesn't make sense. We think it makes sense because you have a party and you have gifts and the food is there and your friends are there, and that's what brings you joy. And joy through those things is awesome, but that's not where joy comes from. That's not the root of it. You see, joy doesn't make sense when you're in situations like Martin. Joy doesn't make sense when you're in situations like the people of Israel were, the Judeans were in that passage from Isaiah that we read. They were laid out. They had traveled miles to this dream in their head only to arrive and realize that the dream was a nightmare. There were no beautiful homes and pristine walls and temples to worship in. In place of all of that was rubble. Enemies prowled around to take advantage of them. The gardens they had promised to feed them were trampled under. Everything they had hoped for was gone. And all that was left was these torn down buildings and bricks and rubble that they had to camp out in the middle of because they had nowhere else to go. And yet, trapped in that rubble, they were not alone. For the Lord had anointed them to deliver a message that the presence of God was coming to bring the year of the Lord's favor, to bring Jubilee. It was time for a divine reset. And when they had hit rock bottom where they were at, it was the perfect place to grow something new. So for all of those that were feeling trapped, there was good news. To you who were poor, God was coming with provision. To the brokenhearted, He was going to mend your brokenness. To the captives and the prisoners, freedom was coming. To those who were mourning and grieving, you could find comfort. And it was true that your loss was real and the hurt is valid, but there was hope on the way. God would replace what had been lost with something beautiful. The theological term we use for that is redemption. It's one of my favorite terms because this is what it is. It says God will take the things that you have that seem so worthless to you, that are lost to you, that are hurt to you, like ashes or rubble, and He'll give you beauty. Like mourning and despair for joy and for praise. And so the sin and the mistakes of your past, the things that have left you trapped, He will take and leave in the rubble as something new blooms within you. There is a new life waiting through this divine reset that God is bringing. Here's a crazy thing about joy too. Just like it was for them, you can experience joy before the circumstances shift for you. The moment that this message arrives of good news for all of them, of the way God is going to redeem them, they're still homeless and they're still hungry in that moment. And yet, because God has promised that this has happened, they can act as if it's a done deal because they trust the one who spoke it. They know that if He said it, then that's really how it's going to be. And so they can celebrate even then. They can give a sacrifice of praise, as Psalm 27:6 says. And what that simply means is that the sacrifice of joy. And what that means is a sacrifice of joy is the ability to find joy in spite of difficult circumstances. So it's not based on what they find themselves in. It's not based on what's happened to them. It's based on something else. Joy is an act of attention. It really is an act of rebellion for the culture that we live in right now, that wants to focus on what's lost or what's at stake or what we're about to lose or who's going to take this from me or that from me. Instead, attention on something else brings joy. We are consumed by what is lost. But instead, we can turn our attention to what remains. And when we look at what remains, no matter what's going on around us, joy has a way of being birthed inside of us. We find reason to celebrate. I think that's one of the reasons why God built in this tithing thing. Because not only is that a way we learn trust and a way we find blessing through God, but it is also a way that reminds us that when I give 10%, I believe, because I've seen this in my own life, I appreciate and value the 90%, at least 10% more. Mark Batterson says that the greatest shortcomings we have might not be the ways that we fail or do evil. It might be in not rejoicing enough in the goodness of God. We are designed and made to enjoy God, no matter where we find ourselves. And too often, we're more consumed by what is missing than by what or who remains with us. And that is why we feel so trapped. Which brings us back to Martin, right? The boy who wasn't there anymore, who was just a shell, a house plant being taken care of. There was one nurse by the name of Verna who believed that somewhere inside of him, he was still present. And so after 13 years, he was able to go and get tested. And they were able to first start and get him to move his eye. And when they moved his eye, he was able to respond, and they would track that. And then he was developed, and they figured out what was going on with him enough. He was able to use a joystick to communicate. Isn't that cool? And then a keyboard which would type, and he would be able to communicate through that and develop and develop. Challenges still persisted, but one thing after another, he was able, with the help of the God who was present with him then, just like he was present with him when nobody else was, to get a job, to go to college, to start a web development company, to write a book about his experience called Ghost Boy. You can go find it. Or even to fall in love and get married. He married a woman by the name of Joanna. And Joanna was attracted to the joy with which Martin lived his life. He had every reason to not have joy, right? Even after he's coming out of that experience of being in a vegetative state, he still had all of these issues he had to overcome, doctor's visits to keep going through, abilities with his body he would never get back. All of that stuff was still true, and yet he had a joy that she could not deny. She talks about him smiling all of the time, so much that his face would hurt and he wouldn't care because he was able to feel it still. A way he would revel in everything. She would sit and watch him eat candy or view a sunset or look at a child play, and just the way he took all of that in and celebrated it with his life, she was so drawn to. And she would say that when she watched the joy in him, it gave birth to joy in her. When he reflected on this, Martin said that there are almost as many new things as there are ways to experience joy. I want you to catch that. It's subtle, but it's really powerful. There are almost as many new things as there are ways to experience joy. In other words, there are more ways to experience joy than there are new things. So when you feel trapped right now, when you feel overwhelmed and you feel stuck and you feel like, what is there to be joyful about? Remember, God is still making things new. A divine reset is available for you, and joy can still be found. There is reason to celebrate because joy is not found in the rubble that you feel trapped in, but in what still remains, in who still remains with you. The God who was with Martin in the hospital is the God who is with you. And as he is working out these things in your life, as he is redeeming your life and taking the old sin and mistakes that you're trapped in and giving you something beautiful out of them, as he's finding the rubble that you're living in and bringing beauty out of that, as he's taking the things that are broken and healing them, as those things are still happening, there are some things that still remain. Your Redeemer lives, and he loves you. He is seated on the throne and is in control of the universe and is making all things new. The best is still yet to come with him. He has plans for your life, and to him, you are a priceless masterpiece. And no matter what you feel about yourself, no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, no matter what rubble you are sitting in the middle of right now, all of that is true. That still remains. And if that is true and that still remains, no matter where you find yourself, no matter what you're going through, turn your attention to what still remains and see if joy, see if even for a second, even in small bits, there is something to celebrate about your life right now. When all seems lost, focus on the one who remains. And it may even be that as you start to live in this joy that exists even when your circumstances are still shifting, others like Joanna might see you. And you might be the one to offer a divine reset to them. That your life and your example will bring good news to the poor and bind the brokenhearted and set the captives free. Not because of your power and goodness and ability, not because you are so awesome, but because the God who is awesome is with you. And he has given you reason to celebrate no matter what else is happening. That is joy that we can have today. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be people who bring joy wherever we go. Lord, we have real reason for pain. We have real reason for heartache. But even in the midst of all of that, when things have been torn down around us, you have come to restore us and to reset our lives. That is part of why the cross took place, God, that through your sacrifice of joy, the joy set before you, you would bear the cross so that we might have real life, abundant life in you, a life that goes beyond our circumstances to know what peace and hope and joy and love really are. Lord, help us to accept that. And I pray if there are those that need to right now, God, that they would stop what they're doing and they would turn to you in this moment and ask for that forgiveness, ask for that belonging, ask to be welcomed into the family, and you will do it. That as we go and live in joy, others might see it, and a divine reset might be brought to them too. God, your people have not lived out the year of Jubilee like you laid it out the first time, but we are still called to bring that message of hope to the world around us. May it begin with me. As you go today, I leave you with a blessing. May you go into the world as bearers of joy, as rebuilders who care for our world, that we might share the good news of great joy that is for all people.